The security camera footage from the convenience store on Devon Avenue that would ultimately convict Arjun Malhotra of double murder showed him calmly purchasing zip ties, bleach, and plastic sheeting at 11:47 p.m. on the night his world collapsed, just 3 hours after he had returned home early from a business trip to find his wife Priya in their marital bed with Rohit Sinha, the man he had considered his closest friend for over a decade and who had been a groomsman at their wedding, a witness to their vows, and a trusted confidant who had listened to Arjun's hopes and fears while secretly planning to destroy his marriage from within. The discovery that had triggered Arjun's descent into murderous rage occurred when he quietly entered their Lincoln Park apartment using his key, expecting to surprise Priya with his early return from Milwaukee, where a supplier meeting had concluded faster than anticipated, only to hear sounds from their bedroom that led him to witness the ultimate betrayal, as the two people he loved and trusted most demonstrated their complete disregard for his emotional well-being and the sacred bonds of marriage, friendship that had formed the foundation of his life in America. The relationship between Arjun and Rohit had begun during their first years as immigrants struggling to establish themselves in Chicago's competitive business environment, where their shared cultural background and similar aspirations had created a brotherhood that sustained them through financial hardships, cultural adaptation challenges, and the loneliness that defined their early immigrant experience before they had established families and community connections that provided emotional support and social stability. The marriage between Arjun and Priya had been arranged through family connections, but had evolved into genuine love and partnership as they worked together to build their American dream through his convenience store business and her accounting career, creating financial security that enabled them to purchase their apartment, support extended family in India, and maintain cultural traditions while embracing opportunities that immigration had provided for economic advancement and social mobility. The friendship that Rohit had cultivated with both Arjun and Priya had seemed to exemplify the best aspects of their immigrant community, where successful professionals supported each other through business advice, cultural celebration, and family relationships that honored traditional values, while adapting to American social environments that required different approaches to professional networking and personal relationship maintenance. The financial pressures that had consumed Arjun's attention during the months preceding his discovery had involved expanding his convenience store operation to compete with corporate chains that threatened small business survival, requiring long hours and frequent travel that had prevented him from recognizing the warning signs that his marriage was deteriorating and his wife was seeking emotional and physical satisfaction from someone who understood her frustrations while exploiting her vulnerability. The emotional distance that had developed between Arjun and Priya reflected not only his business preoccupations, but also cultural differences in their expectations about marriage roles, professional ambitions, and personal freedom that had created ongoing tension despite their shared commitment to building a successful life together and maintaining family relationships that honored both their individual backgrounds and their collective aspirations. The manipulation that Rohit had employed to seduce Priya had exploited her dissatisfaction with aspects of her marriage while presenting himself as someone who appreciated her intelligence and independence in ways that Arjun supposedly failed to recognize, creating emotional intimacy that gradually evolved into physical betrayal that violated every principle of friendship and cultural loyalty that should have prevented such devastating deception. The planning that Arjun undertook after witnessing their betrayal was methodical and deliberate, reflecting his business background and analytical nature as he considered various responses to the crisis, while ultimately deciding that the violation of trust was so fundamental and complete that only permanent elimination of both betrayers could restore his sense of justice and personal honor that had been destroyed by their systematic deception. The community impact that would follow Arjun's crimes would devastate Chicago's Indian-American professional network, where the intersection of cultural values, business relationships, and family loyalty had created social structures that seemed immune to the destructive forces that plagued other communities, but proved vulnerable to the same human weaknesses and moral failures that could destroy lives and relationships. When trust was systematically exploited by people who should have provided support and protection. The convenience store that Arjun Malhotra had built from nothing into a thriving business on Chicago's Devon Avenue represented 15 years of 18-hour workdays, careful financial planning, and unwavering dedication to providing quality service to the diverse neighborhood, where Indian restaurants, grocery stores, and professional offices created a vibrant community that honored cultural traditions while embracing American entrepreneurial opportunities that enabled immigrant families to achieve economic success and social stability. The marriage arrangement that had brought Arjun and Priya together had been facilitated by her aunt in New Jersey, who recognized compatibility between a hardworking immigrant entrepreneur seeking an educated wife and an Indian-American accountant whose family valued traditional marriage while supporting her professional aspirations, creating a partnership that balanced cultural expectations with modern relationship dynamics that honored both individual achievement and collective family obligations. The early years of their marriage had been characterized by mutual respect and shared goals, as Arjun expanded his business operations, while Priya established her accounting practice, with both partners contributing to household finances, while also supporting extended family members in India who depended on their success for educational opportunities and medical care that would have been impossible without their American earnings and professional advancement. The friendship between Arjun and Rohit had developed through their participation in Chicago's Indian Business Association, where successful professionals gathered monthly to discuss market opportunities, regulatory challenges, and cultural adaptation strategies that helped immigrant entrepreneurs navigate American business environments while maintaining connections to their heritage through language, food, and religious observance that provided identity and community support. The social dynamics that characterized their friendship included regular family gatherings where Rohit's bachelor status made him a welcome guest who provided entertainment and cultural conversation while also serving as Arjun's confidant about business challenges and marriage adjustments that required careful navigation between traditional expectations and American relationship styles that emphasized individual autonomy and emotional communication. The financial success that both Arjun and Rohit achieved during their first decade in Chicago had been built through complementary skills and mutual support, with Arjun's retail business acumen helping Rohit understand customer service principles, while Rohit's technology expertise assisted Arjun in implementing computer systems and online marketing strategies that modernized his operations and expanded his customer base beyond the immediate ethnic community. The cultural celebrations that marked important holidays and life events had strengthened bonds between their families, while also creating opportunities for Rohit to develop intimate knowledge of Arjun and Priya's relationship, dynamics, communication patterns, and sources of tension that would later enable him to exploit marital vulnerabilities through carefully calculated emotional manipulation that presented him as understanding and supportive alternative to Arjun's business preoccupations. The business expansion that consumed Arjun's attention during the year before his discovery involved negotiations for a second store location that required substantial capital investment and regulatory compliance that demanded frequent travel to Milwaukee, where suppliers and distributors maintained offices, creating extended absences from home that prevented him from monitoring changes in Priya's behavior and emotional needs. The professional advancement that Priya achieved during this same period included promotion to senior accountant at her firm and increased responsibilities that provided intellectual stimulation and social recognition that contrasted with her domestic role as supportive wife to someone whose business concerns dominated their conversations and limited their social activities to culturally appropriate gatherings that sometimes felt restrictive rather than celebratory. The relationship counseling that Priya had suggested 6 months before the affair began had been dismissed by Arjun as unnecessary expense and cultural inappropriateness that reflected American individualism rather than traditional marriage approaches that emphasized duty, patience, and gradual adaptation rather than immediate emotional satisfaction and constant communication about personal needs and relationship dynamics. The warning signs that Arjun had failed to recognize included Priya's increased attention to personal appearance, unexplained absences from home during evening hours, and emotional distance that manifested as decreased interest in physical intimacy and reduced participation in their shared cultural activities and family obligations that had previously provided structure and meaning for the partnership. The justifications that Arjun had developed for these changes included rational explanations about professional stress, seasonal mood variations, and natural evolution of marital relationships that experienced decreased passion but increased stability over time, preventing him from investigating deeper causes or addressing underlying problems that required immediate attention and significant changes in his priorities and behavior patterns. Call to action. This devastating story shows how betrayal by those closest to us can transform love into deadly obsession and friendship into fatal revenge. If you want to discover more shocking cases where passion, jealousy, and broken trust lead to unthinkable violence, subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell. Because sometimes the greatest danger comes not from strangers, but from those who know exactly how to destroy us. The affair between Priya Malhotra and Rohit Sinha had begun 6 months before Arjun's discovery through carefully orchestrated encounters that exploited his business travel schedule and her emotional vulnerability, with Rohit positioning himself as an understanding friend who appreciated her intelligence and independence, while gradually escalating emotional intimacy into physical betrayal that violated every principle of marriage, loyalty, and friendship, trust that had governed their community relationships. The initial contact that enabled their deception had occurred during a cultural event where Rohit had approached Priya about tax preparation services for his expanding IT consulting business, creating legitimate professional interaction that provided cover for personal conversations about her career aspirations and marriage satisfaction. While Arjun was occupied with networking discussions about retail industry challenges and expansion opportunities. The emotional manipulation that Rohit employed during their early conversations had focused on validating Priya's feelings of intellectual underappreciation and social isolation within her marriage, presenting himself as someone who recognized her professional accomplishments and personal worth, while subtly criticizing Arjun's business preoccupations and traditional expectations that supposedly prevented her from achieving her full potential as an educated American woman. The gradual escalation from professional consultation to personal counseling had been facilitated by Rohit's invitation for coffee meetings, ostensibly related to business tax planning, but increasingly focused on relationship advice and emotional support that filled gaps in her marriage while creating dangerous intimacy between someone's wife and his supposedly loyal friend, who was systematically exploiting trust and cultural obligations for predatory purposes. The physical affair that eventually developed had been preceded by months of emotional adultery, involving shared confidences about marriage dissatisfaction, professional frustrations, and cultural conflicts that created psychological bonds stronger than her commitment to marriage vows, while also providing Rohit with detailed knowledge about Arjun's vulnerabilities and relationship weaknesses that could be exploited for maximum emotional damage. The secret meetings that sustained their affair had been carefully coordinated around Arjun's business, travel, schedule, and work commitments, with Rohit using his knowledge of Arjun's routines and plans to arrange encounters at his apartment, hotel rooms during supposed business trips, and even their marital home when circumstances provided opportunities for ultimate violation of trust and sacred space that represented their marriage bond. The psychological justifications that both Priya and Rohit had developed for their betrayal included claims about emotional incompatibility between her and Arjun, assertions that their friendship transcended marriage obligations, and rationalizations about cultural evolution that supposedly made traditional marriage expectations obsolete for educated professionals who deserved personal happiness, regardless of commitments to spouses and community standards. The financial arrangements that had enabled their deception included Rohit's payment for hotel rooms and restaurant meetings disguised as business expenses, while Priya used her accounting skills to hide expenditures for clothing and personal care that enhanced her attractiveness for someone other than her husband, who was working extended hours to support their lifestyle and family obligations. The communication methods that facilitated their ongoing relationship had included encrypted messaging applications, separate email accounts, and careful coordination of phone calls during times when Arjun was unavailable to monitor her activities, demonstrating sophisticated planning that revealed the calculated nature of their deception rather than spontaneous romantic attraction that might have warranted sympathy or understanding. The risk escalation that characterized their relationship during the final months before discovery had included increasingly bold encounters in locations where community members might recognize them, suggesting either growing confidence in their ability to maintain deception or psychological need for excitement that overrode rational concern about potential consequences for their reputations, careers, and family relationships. The plans for future relationship development that Priya and Rohit had discussed included her eventual divorce from Arjun and their potential marriage once legal and financial arrangements could be completed, revealing that their affair was intended as permanent replacement rather than temporary escape from marriage dissatisfaction, making their betrayal even more devastating and complete. The cultural violations that their relationship represented extended beyond individual adultery, to include systematic exploitation of Indian community trust, friendship obligations, and marriage traditions that were supposed to provide protection and stability for families who maintained cultural values while adapting to American social environments that presented different challenges and temptations. The discovery that would transform Arjun Malhotra from devoted husband and loyal friend into double murderer occurred at 9:15 p.m. on a Tuesday evening when he quietly entered his Lincoln Park apartment expecting to surprise Priya with his early return from Milwaukee, only to hear unmistakable sounds from their bedroom that led him to witness the ultimate betrayal as his wife and best friend demonstrated their complete disregard for his emotional well-being and the sacred bonds that had formed the foundation of his life in America. The shock of recognition was so complete and disorienting that Arjun initially remained frozen in their doorway, watching as the two people he loved and trusted most continued their intimate encounter without awareness of his presence, creating psychological trauma that combined visual evidence of betrayal with the devastating realization that their passion and emotional connection exceeded anything he had experienced with either of them in their respective relationships. The confrontation that followed his discovery began with Arjun's demand for explanation and immediate departure of both betrayers from his home, but quickly escalated into accusations and counter-accusations that revealed the systematic nature of their deception and their lack of genuine remorse for destroying his trust, while also exposing their detailed plans for continuing their relationship, regardless of the emotional devastation they had inflicted. The justifications that Priya and Rohit attempted to provide for their affair included claims about her marriage, dissatisfaction, and emotional neglect that supposedly justified seeking fulfillment elsewhere, while Rohit suggested that friendship loyalties were less important than authentic love and personal happiness that transcended traditional obligations and cultural expectations about marriage, fidelity, and social responsibility. The emotional manipulation that both betrayers employed during their confrontation included attempts to blame Arjun for creating conditions that had forced their desperate search for genuine connection, suggestions that his business preoccupations had made their affair inevitable, and assertions that their relationship represented evolution beyond outdated marriage concepts, rather than simple betrayal of trust and cultural values. The revelation of specific details about their affair during the heated argument that followed created additional psychological trauma as Arjun learned about the duration of their deception, the locations where they had met, and the extent to which they had used his absence and trust to facilitate encounters that violated not only his marriage but also his home, his friendship, and his fundamental understanding of human loyalty and moral responsibility. The threats that Arjun made during the height of his emotional crisis reflected his complete psychological breakdown as he processed the destruction of relationships that had provided meaning and identity throughout his immigrant experience, leading to verbal expressions of violence that would later be used as evidence of premeditation despite their spontaneous origin in devastating emotional trauma. The departure of Priya and Rohit from his apartment had been temporary, tactical retreat rather than permanent separation, as they continued their relationship while expecting that Arjun would eventually accept their decision and accommodate divorce proceedings that would enable them to formalize their partnership without significant financial or social consequences that might interfere with their professional and personal goals. The isolation that Arjun experienced during the hours following their departure was compounded by cultural factors that prevented him from seeking support from family members or community leaders who would view his situation as shameful, evidence of failure to maintain proper marriage relationships, and masculine authority that was expected within traditional cultural frameworks that governed immigrant family dynamics. The planning that began during Arjun's solitary night of processing his discovery was initially focused on divorce proceedings and business asset protection, but gradually evolved into more desperate considerations as he recognized that Priya's superior education and earning potential would likely result in financial settlements that could destroy his business and eliminate his ability to support extended family obligations that remained central to his identity and cultural responsibilities. The psychological state that Arjun reached by dawn reflected complete breakdown of his rational decision-making processes as grief, rage, and humiliation combined to create mental crisis, where violence seemed like the only response that could restore his sense of justice and personal honor, while also eliminating ongoing threats to his reputation and financial security that had been created by their systematic betrayal. The research that Arjun conducted during the following days included investigation of divorce law, asset division procedures, and potential criminal charges related to adultery that revealed his legal vulnerability and the likelihood that his betrayers would face minimal consequences, while he suffered devastating financial and social penalties that seemed completely disproportionate to their moral failures and systematic deception. The methodical planning that consumed Arjun Malhotra during the week following his discovery of the affair reflected his business background and analytical nature as he researched murder methods, disposal techniques, and alibis that could enable him to eliminate both betrayers while avoiding detection by law enforcement agencies that might not understand the cultural and emotional factors that justified extreme response to such fundamental violation of trust and honor. The surveillance that Arjun conducted of both Priya and Rohit revealed their continued relationship and complete lack of concern about the emotional devastation they had caused as they maintained their affair, while apparently expecting that he would passively accept their decision and facilitate divorce proceedings that would enable them to formalize their partnership without significant consequences for their professional reputations or social standing. The weapon selection that occupied Arjun's attention involved careful consideration of methods that would ensure death, while minimizing physical evidence that could link him to the crimes, leading him to research pharmaceutical options, mechanical approaches, and environmental factors that could create plausible alternative explanations for their deaths that would deflect suspicion away from obvious motive related to their adultery and his emotional trauma. The location planning that Arjun undertook focused on identifying circumstances where he could access both victims simultaneously while avoiding witnesses or security cameras that might document his presence during the time frame when murders occurred, requiring detailed knowledge of their schedules and habits that his previous friendship and marriage relationships had provided through normal social interaction and shared activities. The alibi preparation that Arjun developed involved creating false business meetings and supplier consultations that would place him away from Chicago during the planned murder timeframe, while also establishing communication records and financial transactions that could be used to support his claims about legitimate business activities that had nothing to do with personal revenge or criminal violence. The psychological preparation that Arjun required to overcome normal moral inhibitions against killing involved systematic dehumanization of his targets through focus on their betrayal and lack of remorse, while also developing justifications based on cultural honor concepts and family protection that presented murder as duty rather than crime, within traditional frameworks that governed masculine responsibility and community justice. The financial arrangements that Arjun made in preparation for potential consequences included transferring business assets to relatives in India who could maintain operations if he was arrested, while also liquidating investments and establishing offshore accounts that could provide resources for legal defense or family support if his criminal activities were discovered and prosecuted. The timing coordination that was essential for his plan required careful monitoring of both victims' schedules to identify optimal opportunity when they would be together in location where he could access them without detection, while also ensuring that his own absence from normal routines would not attract attention from business associates or community members who might later provide testimony about suspicious behavior. The equipment acquisition that Arjun undertook during his planning phase included purchases from multiple stores using cash payments to avoid creating paper trails that could link him to murder weapons or disposal materials, while also researching online sources for specialized items that required careful procurement to avoid triggering suspicion from vendors or shipping companies. The rehearsal activities that Arjun conducted included trial runs of his planned approach routes, timing estimates for various phases of his operation, and contingency planning for unexpected circumstances that might require adaptation of his methods or complete abandonment of his plan if conditions did not provide adequate safety margins for successful completion and escape. The final decision to proceed with murder was triggered by his discovery that Priya and Rohit were planning to announce their relationship publicly within their community, representing ultimate humiliation that would destroy his reputation and social standing, while also demonstrating their complete lack of respect for his emotional well-being and cultural values that should have prevented such devastating betrayal. The emotional state that Arjun had reached by the time he committed to violence reflected complete psychological breakdown, where murder seemed like the only response that could restore justice and honor, while also eliminating ongoing sources of pain and humiliation that would have made normal life impossible within their community, where everyone would know about his failure to maintain proper marriage, relationships, and masculine authority. The double murder that Arjun Malhotra committed on the night of November 15th took place at Rohit Sinha's downtown apartment, where he had arranged to meet with both his betrayers under the pretense of discussing divorce, arrangements, and business asset division, but instead implemented his carefully planned revenge that would eliminate them both while creating crime scene evidence designed to suggest robbery or random violence rather than calculated execution motivated by adultery and friendship, betrayal. The entry that Arjun gained to Rohit's apartment building was facilitated by his knowledge of security procedures and resident access codes that he had learned through their friendship, enabling him to avoid detection by doormen or surveillance cameras while carrying equipment that would be used for restraint, murder, and evidence disposal in circumstances that provided privacy and time necessary for completing his plan without interruption. The confrontation that preceded the murders began with Arjun's demand that both betrayers acknowledge the full extent of their deception and express genuine remorse for destroying his marriage and friendship, but their continued justifications and lack of authentic guilt triggered his final psychological breakdown, where violence became the only response that could restore his sense of justice and personal honor. The restraint methods that Arjun employed involved zip ties and duct tape that he had practiced using during his preparation phase, enabling him to immobilize both victims while maintaining control over the situation and preventing their escape or resistance that might have interfered with his planned execution or created additional evidence that could link him to their deaths. The murder techniques that Arjun used reflected his research into methods that would cause death while minimizing physical evidence on his person or clothing, involving strangulation and suffocation that required close physical contact but avoided blood evidence that might be difficult to eliminate during his escape, and disposal of materials that had been used during the commission of his crimes. The psychological state that Arjun experienced during the actual murders combined rage and satisfaction as he watched his betrayers suffer consequences for their systematic deception, while also maintaining sufficient rational control to implement evidence disposal procedures and staging techniques that were designed to mislead investigators about motives and potential suspects who might have committed random crimes. The staging activities that Arjun conducted after completing the murders included ransacking the apartment to suggest robbery, removing valuable items that could be disposed of separately, and eliminating personal belongings that might indicate the personal nature of their relationship conflicts or provide evidence of his planning and preparation for their elimination. The disposal procedures that Arjun had researched involved multiple steps for eliminating physical evidence, including clothing changes, equipment destruction, and systematic cleaning that would remove DNA traces and other forensic evidence that could link him to the crime scene, despite his careful preparation and execution of methods designed to avoid detection by modern investigative techniques. The alibi establishment that Arjun implemented during and after the murders involved creating false evidence of his presence at business meetings in Milwaukee through phone calls, credit card transactions, and witness interactions that were designed to provide verifiable proof of his distance from Chicago during the time frame when murders occurred. The emotional aftermath that Arjun experienced following the completion of his revenge was a complex combination of satisfaction about achieving justice and growing anxiety about potential consequences, as he recognized that his carefully planned crime might still be detected through investigative methods that he had not anticipated or evidence that he had failed to eliminate completely. The return to normal routines that Arjun attempted during the days following the murders required sophisticated psychological performance, as he expressed appropriate shock and grief about the deaths of his wife and friend while interacting with community members, law enforcement investigators, and media representatives who sought information about their characters and relationships. The investigation that began immediately after discovery of the bodies focused initially on robbery theories that seemed consistent with staging evidence, but gradually shifted toward personal motives, as investigators recognized inconsistencies in physical evidence and witness statements that suggested more complex relationships between victims and potential suspects who had access and motive for committing targeted violence rather than random crime. The investigation that would ultimately expose Arjun Malhotra's carefully planned double murder began when Chicago police detective Maria Rodriguez noticed inconsistencies between the staged robbery scene and the actual evidence at Rohit Sinha's apartment, where the systematic nature of violence and selective removal of items suggested personal knowledge of the victims rather than random criminal activity by unknown perpetrators seeking quick financial gain through burglary. The forensic analysis that was conducted by the crime scene investigation team revealed evidence that contradicted robbery theories, including the sophisticated use of restraints that indicated premeditation, the personal nature of violence that suggested emotional motivation, and the absence of fingerprints or DNA evidence that indicated careful preparation by someone familiar with investigative techniques rather than spontaneous criminal opportunity. The witness interviews that police conducted with neighbors and building security personnel provided timeline information that contradicted Arjun's alibi claims, including testimony about suspicious individuals near the building during the murder timeframe, and descriptions of activities that were inconsistent with legitimate business meetings or social visits that might have innocent explanations. The financial investigation that examined both victims' bank records and credit card activities revealed the extensive affair between Priya and Rohit, including hotel charges, restaurant bills, and travel expenses that documented their relationship, while also providing investigators with clear motive for domestic violence by someone whose marriage and friendship had been systematically betrayed through their deception. The communication analysis that investigators conducted through examination of phone records and electronic devices revealed the planning and coordination that had enabled the affair, while also identifying suspicious gaps in normal communication patterns during the period before the murders that suggested awareness of danger or attempts to avoid detection by someone who might have discovered their relationship. The alibi investigation that focused on Arjun's claimed presence in Milwaukee during the murder timeframe revealed multiple inconsistencies and fabricated evidence, including false witness statements, manipulated credit card transactions, and timeline impossibilities that demonstrated systematic deception rather than legitimate business activities that would have prevented his involvement in the crimes. The psychological evaluation that was requested by investigators revealed personality changes and behavioral patterns consistent with someone planning violent revenge, including social isolation, financial preparations, and emotional detachment that indicated psychological breakdown rather than normal grief responses that would be expected from someone who had lost his wife and friend to random violence. The surveillance review that investigators conducted revealed security camera footage from multiple locations that contradicted Arjun's alibi while placing him in Chicago during the murder timeframe, including images from his convenience store, traffic cameras near Rohit's apartment building, and retail establishments where he had purchased murder weapons and disposal materials. The forensic accounting that was performed on Arjun's business and personal finances revealed suspicious cash withdrawals and equipment purchases that corresponded with his planning timeline, while also demonstrating his knowledge of investigation procedures through attempts to avoid creating paper trails that could link him to murder weapons or disposal materials. The community pressure that developed as news of the investigation spread throughout Chicago's Indian American professional network created additional stress for Arjun, as friends and business associates began questioning his emotional state, and potential involvement in crimes that had devastated their community, while also challenging cultural assumptions about honor, marriage, and appropriate responses to betrayal. The arrest warrant that was issued for Arjun Malhotra was based on accumulated evidence that demonstrated both motive and opportunity, while eliminating alternative theories about random violence or unknown perpetrators, leading to his apprehension at his convenience store, where he had been attempting to maintain normal business operations despite the mounting investigation and community suspicion. The confession that Arjun eventually provided to investigators after his arrest revealed the systematic planning and emotional breakdown that had motivated his crimes, while also expressing continued justification for his actions based on cultural honor concepts and the complete betrayal of trust that had destroyed his marriage, friendship, and social standing within their immigrant community. The criminal trial of Arjun Malhotra began 14 months after his arrest for the double murder of his wife Priya and best friend Rohit Sinha, during which time the Chicago Indian American community had struggled to process not only the devastating crimes, but also the cultural implications of domestic violence and honor-based thinking that had motivated someone they had respected to commit premeditated murder against people whose betrayal had violated traditional marriage and friendship obligations. The prosecution's case was built around forensic evidence that proved Arjun's presence at the murder scene, despite his elaborate alibi attempts, financial records that documented his systematic preparation, including weapon purchases and disposal materials, and psychological testimony that explained how the discovery of adultery had triggered mental breakdown that culminated in carefully planned revenge against both betrayers. The evidence presentation that occupied the first 3 weeks of trial included detailed forensic analysis of the crime scene that contradicted staging attempts designed to suggest robbery, surveillance footage that placed Arjun in Chicago during the murder timeframe, despite his claims about business travel, and communication records that revealed his knowledge of the affair and planning activities that preceded the killings. The defense strategy attempted to portray Arjun as a victim of extreme emotional distress who had committed crimes of passion rather than premeditated murder, emphasizing cultural factors that made adultery and friendship betrayal particularly devastating within Indian immigrant communities where honor and family reputation were central to social identity and community standing. The expert testimony about cultural honor concepts and their role in domestic violence provided context for understanding Arjun's psychological state while also challenging stereotypes about immigrant communities and honor killings that suggested cultural factors could excuse or justify murder, rather than explaining motivations that remained criminal, regardless of traditional values or emotional trauma. The victim impact statements that were presented by family members and friends of both Priya and Rohit provided powerful testimony about their characters and contributions to their community, while also documenting the devastating impact of their deaths on relatives and colleagues who had been inspired by their professional success and cultural contributions, despite their moral failures in maintaining appropriate marriage and friendship boundaries. The psychological evaluation that was conducted for the defense revealed personality disorders and emotional dependencies that had made Arjun particularly vulnerable to betrayal trauma, while also explaining his ability to plan and execute sophisticated crimes, despite his previous reputation as peaceful businessman and devoted husband who had never demonstrated violent tendencies or criminal behavior. The community testimony that was provided by religious leaders and business associates created complex dynamics as witnesses struggled to balance respect for traditional values with condemnation of violence, while also addressing cultural pressures that might have contributed to Arjun's psychological breakdown without excusing his decision to commit murder rather than pursuing legal remedies or community mediation. The forensic psychiatry expert who testified about Arjun's mental state during the planning and execution phases explained how betrayal, trauma, and cultural shame could trigger psychological breakdown while maintaining that his systematic preparation and evidence disposal demonstrated rational thinking that contradicted claims about temporary insanity or diminished capacity that might have reduced his criminal responsibility. The jury selection process had been complicated by cultural factors and community relationships that required careful screening to identify individuals who could evaluate evidence objectively without being influenced by stereotypes about immigrant communities or personal views about adultery and appropriate responses to marriage betrayal that might bias their assessment of criminal responsibility. The deliberation that lasted 5 days reflected jurors' struggle with complex questions about cultural factors, emotional trauma, and premeditation that required them to balance sympathy for Arjun's devastating betrayal, with recognition that murder was never justified, regardless of provocation or cultural values that emphasized honor and masculine authority within traditional marriage relationships. The guilty verdicts on all charges, including 2 counts of first-degree murder, evidence tampering, and conspiracy, reflected the jury's conclusion that despite cultural factors and emotional trauma, Arjun's systematic planning and execution of both murders demonstrated clear criminal intent that warranted full accountability under American law, rather than reduced charges that might have reflected sympathy for his circumstances or cultural considerations. The sentencing phase of Arjun Malhotra's trial focused on determining appropriate punishment that would reflect both the heinous nature of his premeditated double murder and the complex cultural factors that had contributed to his psychological breakdown, without excusing his decision to eliminate his wife and best friend, rather than pursuing legal remedies or community support that could have helped him process betrayal trauma through nonviolent means. The aggravating factors that prosecutors emphasized during sentencing arguments included the systematic planning that had preceded both murders, the violation of trust involved in using friendship and marriage knowledge to facilitate access to victims, and the devastating impact on the Indian American community, where his crimes had destroyed faith in cultural institutions and created fear about domestic violence within immigrant families. The mitigating factors that defense attorneys presented included Arjun's lack of previous criminal history, his positive contributions to the community through business success and charitable activities, and the extreme emotional distress caused by discovering adultery that had violated cultural values and personal trust in ways that triggered psychological breakdown and temporary loss of rational judgment. The victim impact statements that were presented by family members of both Priya and Rohit provided devastating testimony about their loss, while also addressing the complex emotions associated with mourning people whose moral failures had contributed to the circumstances that led to their deaths, requiring families to process grief while also confronting difficult questions about responsibility and forgiveness. The cultural expert testimony that was provided during sentencing included analysis of honor concepts within Indian immigrant communities and their potential role in domestic violence, while also emphasizing that cultural factors could explain motivations without justifying criminal behavior that violated both American law and authentic Indian values that emphasize nonviolence and spiritual development rather than revenge and violence. The psychological evaluation that was conducted for sentencing purposes revealed the extent of Arjun's mental breakdown and his continued inability to process the moral implications of his actions, suggesting that lengthy incarceration would be necessary not only for public safety, but also for providing time and treatment that might enable him to develop authentic remorse and understanding of the devastating impact his crimes had caused. The community healing testimony that was provided by religious leaders and social service organizations addressed the ongoing trauma within Chicago's Indian American community, while also describing efforts to prevent similar violence through enhanced support services for families experiencing marriage difficulties and cultural conflicts that could escalate to dangerous levels without appropriate intervention and counseling. The restitution orders that were imposed included compensation for funeral expenses and lost income for both victims' families, though financial payments could never adequately address the emotional devastation and community damage that had resulted from crimes that had violated fundamental trust and destroyed faith in cultural institutions that were supposed to provide protection and support. The sentencing decision that imposed life imprisonment without possibility of parole reflected the judge's conclusion that Arjun's crimes represented extreme violation of trust and systematic planning that warranted maximum punishment, while also acknowledging cultural factors and emotional trauma that explained his motivations without reducing his criminal responsibility or the need for permanent incarceration to protect public safety. The appeals process that followed sentencing was unsuccessful, despite defense arguments about inadequate representation and cultural bias in jury selection, with appellate courts consistently ruling that the evidence supporting conviction was overwhelming and that trial procedures had been conducted fairly, according to established legal standards and constitutional requirements for criminal prosecution. The prison adjustment that Arjun experienced during his first years of incarceration included participation in psychological counseling and cultural programs designed to help him process his crimes, while also maintaining connections to legitimate aspects of Indian culture that emphasized nonviolence and spiritual development, rather than honor concepts that had contributed to his decision to commit murder. The ongoing impact on the Indian American community in Chicago included enhanced domestic violence prevention programs, improved support services for families experiencing cultural conflicts and marriage difficulties, and community education initiatives designed to address honor concepts and masculine identity issues that could contribute to violence without abandoning valuable cultural traditions and religious practices that remained central to immigrant community identity. 15 years after Arjun Malhotra murdered his wife Priya and best friend Rohit Sinha in a calculated act of revenge that shocked Chicago's Indian American community and exposed the devastating potential for cultural honor, his concepts to motivate domestic violence when combined with betrayal, trauma, and psychological breakdown, his case continues to influence domestic violence prevention efforts and community education programs that address the intersection of immigration, stress, cultural adaptation, and family violence within ethnic communities. The Priya and Rohit Memorial Foundation that was established by their families has become a leading organization providing domestic violence prevention services specifically designed for immigrant communities where cultural factors and language barriers often prevent victims from accessing traditional support systems, while also addressing honor-based violence and masculine identity issues that can escalate family conflicts into deadly situations requiring immediate intervention and specialized cultural competency. The legislative changes that advocacy efforts helped achieve include enhanced penalties for domestic violence involving cultural honor, motivations, improved training for law enforcement officers investigating crimes within immigrant communities, and strengthened support services for families experiencing cultural conflicts that could escalate to violence without appropriate intervention, and counseling that respects traditional values while promoting nonviolent conflict resolution. The community healing process that occurred within Chicago's Indian American Professional Network demonstrated both the devastating impact of honor-based violence and the resilience of communities that unite to address cultural factors contributing to domestic violence, while maintaining valuable traditions and religious practices that emphasize nonviolence, spiritual development, and family harmony, rather than revenge and masculine domination. The research initiatives that emerged from academic study of Arjun's case contributed to enhanced understanding of how cultural adaptation, stress, and betrayal trauma could combine to trigger extreme violence within immigrant families, while also advancing knowledge about effective prevention strategies that addressed cultural honor concepts without reinforcing stereotypes or abandoning legitimate cultural values that remained important for community identity. The educational programs that were developed to address honor-based violence included culturally sensitive materials about healthy relationship dynamics, nonviolent conflict resolution techniques, and resources for recognizing warning signs of escalating domestic violence that could be addressed through community intervention before reaching dangerous levels, requiring law enforcement involvement or emergency protection services. The victim support services that were enhanced in response to advocacy efforts showed significant improvements in helping immigrant families navigate domestic violence situations while maintaining respect for cultural values and religious beliefs that remained important for healing and recovery, with increased reporting rates and successful interventions that reflected better understanding of cultural factors and language barriers. The international cooperation that developed through foundation initiatives included partnerships with organizations in India and other countries working to address honor-based violence and domestic abuse within traditional family structures, sharing resources and strategies that could protect vulnerable individuals while respecting cultural diversity and legitimate traditional values that promoted family harmony rather than violence. The psychological research that continued to emerge from study of cultural factors in domestic violence advanced understanding of how immigration, stress, cultural adaptation challenges, and identity conflicts could contribute to mental health crises that required specialized intervention approaches, balancing individual therapy with community support and cultural healing that addressed collective trauma and social cohesion. The ongoing impact of advocacy efforts extends beyond individual protection to include systematic improvements in domestic violence prevention, cultural competency training, and community education that continue to evolve in response to changing immigration patterns and cultural dynamics, while maintaining focus on protecting vulnerable individuals from violence, regardless of cultural background or traditional values that might be exploited to justify harmful behavior. The story of Arjun Malhotra serves as a permanent reminder that while cultural traditions and community values provide important sources of identity and social support for immigrant families, these same institutions can become dangerous when honor concepts and masculine identity issues are allowed to override fundamental principles of nonviolence and respect for human life that form the foundation of civilized society. His legacy lives on through the enhanced domestic violence prevention services his crimes made necessary, the cultural competency training that helps law enforcement and social service providers better understand immigrant community dynamics, and the ongoing education efforts that work to prevent similar tragedies by addressing cultural honor, concepts, and identity issues before they escalate to violence that destroys families and communities.